So can I get a yay after a long series of really complex topics? We get to finish out this series with what is something less than a complex topic, that is backup and then ultimately restore. And backup and recovery are important. Luckily, these days, backup and recovery is once again an easy thing to do. Back in the earliest of days with NT Backup was a remarkably simple tool, and things got a little weird when Microsoft started to implement technologies like Windows Server Backup because they created this backup solution that was cool, but it wasn't really cool until you tried to figure out what they were thinking when they decided to implement it. It actually took Microsoft a pretty extended period of time to develop a Windows Server backup solution that actually worked in the way that I think we IT pros wanted it to again. I can think for a lot of years I was missing NT backup for a long time. Now, when Windows Server Backup came out, one of the biggest issues with it was the fact that it originally was focused just on volumes. And in order to do a backup, you pointed the backup at a volume and you could back up the volume and only the volume. And in some cases, you could only restore the volume. But that didn't really grok when we needed to back up individual files and folders. These days, Windows Server Backup is a much more fully featured solution. And in fact, today with Windows Server Backup, you can do some pretty cool things like bare metal restore and system state restores. These were available before, but they're a little bit better implemented now in the current version of Windows Server Backup. More so than at any point in the past, I think I can honestly recommend for a really small environment that I might actually kind of point you to Windows Server Backup as a solution if you don't feel like spending a bunch of money for some third-party tool. Now, in this nugget, we're going to talk about how to configure Windows Server Backups, and you have probably already done this before, so it's going to be a relatively easy thing, if not complete and total review for you. What you may not have done before is this new technology called Windows Azure Backups. Very important. Windows Azure Backups. They're going to give you the ability to offload the contents of a machine and its hard drive off into the ether, off into the cloud somewhere, so that this Windows server and its hard drive gets a secondary location that can survive the loss of your entire site. However, in this iteration, Windows Azure does not do things like bare metal restore. It does not do things like system state restore. It does not do things like USB-based hard drives and all the little edge cases that we can sometimes see in these situations. So you're going to use Windows Azure Backup as a solution for your data, not for backing up your servers and bringing servers back online. Okay, very important differentiation when we're talking about the difference between WSB and WAB, I guess. I also want to talk a bit about role-specific backups, and there's just one little gotcha here that you should be prepared for. You may already be aware that there is a group called Backup Operators, if I can spell today, Operators. And the Backup Operators group is ostensibly designed for the group of people that you have belly button as the people who do backups. But the biggest concern here as it relates to configuring role-specific backups has to do with the fact that the permissions, the default permissions on backup operators are perhaps too open, too free. If you really want to lock down who gets access to do what, the backup operators group can back up a machine and restore a machine, but they can also shut down a machine, log on locally to it, and access the computer from the network. So if you need to be able to kind of tailor things down, there is a way using local group policy, the user rights assessment, that you can kind of just configure how you might actually create your own role-specific backup operator that is not the default backup operators right out of the box. I'll point that to you. Really simple, place where you can go if you want to, again, lock those down just a little bit further. And then the last one here are just this command line tool called VSS Admin, and how you can use VSS Admin as a tool to identify who your VSS providers are, and how you can also use it to manage shadow copies if you plan on implementing shadow copies. So I'll tell you how that works. Before we go into actually kind of talking about backups themselves, I want to step out to step away from the exam. This is probably nothing that I would expect that you should see on the exam, but I want to talk a bit about VSS just in general because it's just useful for you to understand why the providers exist, and or why the writers exist, and why how they're different from the requesters and the providers, and what a snapshot actually means in the parlance of VSS. So VSS itself actually is a service that is made up of three different parts. On one side, you have the VSS requester. The VSS requester is in every case a backup application. So it could be Windows Server backup, or Windows Azure backup, or it could be your Symantec backup, or it could be your Bob's Backup Company backup, or any application that you use to initiate a backup. This is separated from what we think of as the VSS writers, because the backup applications are the ones that are kind of orchestrating all the backups for probably a lot of different computers on the network. Well, for the different applications that are installed onto your Windows servers, many of those applications have transactional databases or other types of locking-oriented file mechanisms that can make just a standard backup not work very well. You ever tried to just copy an Exchange database? You know that you can't because it's locked for use, because Exchange got it locked open as an active database. And so if you try to back it up without having some sort of mechanism to quiet the database, it's not going to work. Well, that's what the job of the VSS writer is. The writers are little pieces of code that are written by each individual application. So there's a writer for Exchange, a writer for SQL Server, a writer for Active Directory, a writer for other third-party solutions like Oracle. There's a Hyper-V writer. There's all kinds of different writers out there. And the writer is designed as its job is to quiet its own database when it gets a request from the requester. So the whole point of this is you're the happy little admin over here, are attempting to, with your white hat, with your white administrator hat, tell your backup application, go ahead and initiate a backup. So you say, hey, go ahead and initiate a backup. Well, the first step in that process is for the requester, the application, to then talk to the VSS writer and say, hey, a backup is about to happen. If you're Microsoft Exchange, go ahead and do whatever it is, whatever is appropriate to make sure that you're aware a backup is coming. Quiet yourself, create a snapshot, do whatever you need to do to get that thing ready for a backup. Then, once all these have registered and all the things that they need to do have been accomplished, the requester and the writer then work with your provider, which is most commonly just a piece of storage, in order to transfer the contents then onto some piece of disk. There are multiple different writers because there can potentially be multiple different applications on a machine. Tends not to be, but there can be. And that each of the types of transactional databases can write their own code for what to do when they know they're getting a request from some backup application. Now again, this is nothing you're ever going to have to worry about for an exam, but it's just nice to be able to know why things exist in the way that they do, why VSS exists in the way that it does as well. So here we are back on file 1. This is my file server ostensibly, and I want to show you the variety of different backup solutions that we can use. I have already on this server come to Roles and Features and added in the Windows Server Backup feature, which is down here at the bottom under Features, right there. Absolutely nothing to see with this install, but I just wanted to get it installed so we could take a look at what it looks like. Once Windows Server Backup is installed, well then you'll see that we get the console here, and this console is the location where I can then determine if I want to back up a server or set up a backup schedule. Prior to doing that, you may want to configure the performance settings here, which is really, this is kind of a poorly worded item here. What this is really saying is, do you want to do a full backup, right? Or do you want to do what is essentially an incremental backup? So just track the changes between this and the last backup and just back up that last one. That's really what we're talking about here when we refer to performance settings, and then I can set it for each of the different volumes if I want. When I'm creating a backup, whether it's a single backup or a schedule, there's a couple of things you got to be aware of with how Windows Server Backup works. Remember, Windows Server Backup was originally designed, it was originally intended to focus on volumes as the unit of backup. It's since been adjusted so that I can make some custom changes here and add individual folders or individual drives instead of just entire volumes. So I can back up just the user's folder if I want. Now this is important because when Microsoft first invented or released Windows Server Backup, the point was to try to create a solution that could back up files and folders, but also could back up entire machines and make them available for restore through some bare metal restoration process. In order to do that, you obviously have to have the system drive for the machine that you plan on bringing back to life, also the system state, and also the bare metal recovery stuff. These are necessary for you to be able to accomplish that bare metal recovery of this machine. So it's kind of obvious because it's called bare metal recovery, but be aware that these are all the bits that are necessary if you plan on needing to accomplish that bare metal recovery at some point into the future. Now also, whenever you go about initiating a backup, we can set things like exclusions. So don't back up anything with a .mp3 extension. But more importantly, the item over here called VSS settings is something you should be aware of. Probably a good test question. It seems like it would be. We'll talk more about VSS here in just a minute in terms of the command line structure of it. But when I'm using VSS, I have the option of choosing whether or not I want to check off the fact that these files have actually been backed up. If you are not using any other backup product to back up applications, the full backup will update the backup history and clear the application log files. So this is important again if you are not using any other product. But if you are, the VSS copy is not going to set those archive bits. So be prepared if you're planning on using some other solution to not do this, because a VSS full backup could impact whatever you're trying to do with your other backup solution. So take caution here in configuring which of the options that you choose. Once you've done that, you can choose a backup time, once a day or more than once a day, and then I can determine what my destination type is going to be. So again, the whole point of Windows Server Backup in its initial implementation was volume focused. And really the point of Windows Server Backup also was for you to create a dedicated hard drive, a dedicated volume that was not even really accessible by you or other users. It was only accessible for Windows Server Backup. Now, when Microsoft released this, they did this because as a disk-to-disk based backup solution, if I have a dedicated hard drive, I get some really good performance out of it. And I make sure that I don't inadvertently end up corrupting the data, and a whole variety of pretty sound reasons why it makes sense to have a dedicated disk. However, when they made this as the only option in the original versions of Windows Server Backup, the universe exploded. And IT pros everywhere said, I cannot deal with this. This is nothing I can handle. I have to have the ability to use other mechanisms in order to, oh, that's funny. There's a truck full of ice that's about ready to fall. Oh, truck full of ice is just about falling off the road here. That's funny. Careful, truck full of ice. We don't need that all over the ground. Did I ever tell you that my office is in front of a 7-Eleven? And all day long, I get to see some of the most interesting things that go on at that 7-Eleven just outside. People and trucks full of ice and ambulances going by. One of those days. Anyway, so when it comes to backups, I can choose a dedicated device, and that's actually the recommended way because of some of these performance and other issues. But in later versions, I now have the ability to do a non-dedicated backup as well, or non-dedicated drive. Not recommended because of the performance issues as backups are going on, but it is available, and again, only because IT pros everywhere screamed that they needed this ability. I can back up to a shared network folder as well. However, you will only have one backup at a time because the new backup overwrites the previous backup whenever you're using a shared network folder. This can bite you if you're not prepared for it because you're only going to have last night's backup. And if you're setting up these schedules, it's just going to continuously overwrite the backup that exists. So be aware that if you're planning on using Windows Server Backup, it's probably a good idea to have a hard disk dedicated to backups. It doesn't have to be an internal hard disk. It can just be a volume. It could even be a USB drive if you wanted to. But that's really the best implementation of this today. When you do select that, then you can choose what disk is available. There are no external disks that are found here, and there also are no disks that are plugged into this machine that are not already used for other purposes. I've already got drive letters on these other disks. So if I've got disks that are being used, you're not going to see these here in this list of destination disks. I will, however, see them if I back them up to an existing volume. Once you go through the process, it'll complete a backup, and then, well, there you have it. That backup will continue. Now, Windows Server backup is one thing, but there is also perhaps the desire to use a technology like Windows Azure as a mechanism to perform backups as well. And I want to show you just kind of how you can accomplish that. And I'm going to actually use our own, so my company is Concentrated Technology. I'm going to use actually our own account as the mechanism to be able to show you how this works. So here in our account, in our Azure account, and you can create your own Azure account for a trial basis just to see how things work. Here in our own account, I have this vault that was created. And for some reason, I actually created the vault in East Asia. So hello, all my friends over in East Asia. You have my backup vault account for some reason. But that actually gets created down here under Recovery Services. You can create another vault if you want under Recovery Services, either for Hyper-V Recovery Manager or as a backup vault. And when you do, you got to give it a name. You got to figure out which Microsoft data center you want to put it in, and then which subscription you're going to use, either your trial or, in my case, I have a Visual Studio with MSDN subscription that we're using for this. When you create the vault, it takes a minute or so to create the vault. That vault, you can think of it just essentially as a piece of storage, a location where we can store backups onto. When it comes time to actually use this vault, we can then, if I can find where this is at right here, we then need to upload a public or a certificate that we trust to the backup vault. Now, we've already gone through all this certificate stuff when we're talking about ADCS, and if you don't have a publicly trusted certificate, you can generate your own. There are a couple of requirements that you'll need to go through in order to create that certificate. Any SSL certificate, X509 v3 at least 2048 bits, has to have client authentication in the extended key usage, has to be valid, has to be in the personal certificate store, the local computer, the private key should be in it, it should be exported as a .sir file. As long as you've got these things in the certificate that you've created, you may want to create your own template in order to ensure that all these requirements exist. You can create the certificate, enroll for the certificate, export the certificate, and then upload that certificate here by clicking Browse for File. Okay, it's a .sir file. Just export it, import it in here, and that creates the connection for you to be able to then download, or excuse me, upload your backup content up into Windows Azure. Once you accomplish that, you can download the agent for your server and use that agent to register with Windows Azure. I've already downloaded a copy of the agent here. And this agent requires just a couple of prerequisites, not the least of which is the Windows Identity Foundation, which will be installed automatically, .NET Framework 4, and Windows PowerShell. You can configure the installation folder and the cache location where the application will keep track of those files that are backed up from your computer. Once you install it, then pretty much the actual configuration process, other than connecting it up to Azure, is like any old backup solution that's out there. So if I take a look here and then I click up here into Windows Azure Backup, well, then I can see it looks relatively similar to the Windows Server backup that I was looking at before. Going to have to register the server here with Windows Azure and go through that process of connecting up with the server to get that connection laid into place. Now, every so often, you may have the need, depending on how you construct your backups, whether they're Azure or not, in order to make sure that you have the right people with the right permissions, you might want to set up some role-specific backups. It's one of the objectives here for this objective domain. And you may already be aware that there is this backup operators group that's available by default in Windows, but as I said before, that backup operators group may have just too many permissions for what you want to provide for that person. Now, one of the ways in which you can kind of restrict the amount of permissions that that backup operator user might have is by simply just creating another group. And then with that other group, just changing whatever rights and privileges the other group might need, like, for example, backup files and directories, and restore files and directories right here. In the real world, most of us would probably just give the backup operators group the access they need, because if you could argue that you may need to either log on or access the computer from the network in order to restore files, but this just seems like one of those questions that may be necessary if you need to lock things down. Now, the last topic that we have to talk about here is the VSS Admin tool. VSS Admin is a command line tool that you can use for managing a variety of tasks here in VSS. And I will show you that for a server, VSS Admin has a couple more different commands that are supported than what you would find on a Windows client. So if you run this on a Windows client, you're going to get mainly the list options, but not the create options. So let's say, for example, you want to list the writers that have been, the VSS writers that have been registered with this server. VSS Admin List Writers gives you that list of which writers are there to be able to respond to a backup request when a backup application is ready to go. So the bits writer, the shadow copy optimization writer, the VSS metadata store writer, task scheduler writer. If I had Exchange on here, I would see that. If I had Active Directory, I would see that. I can do VSS admin list providers as well if I want to see which providers are there. Now, the other thing that you can use VSS Admin for, and in fact, the original reason why VSS Admin was created in the first place, is not so much for doing this snapshot creation for backups, but is in creating snapshots for the use by the previous versions client, which has been around for a really long time. In fact, if I look here at the properties of a share, I'll see the previous versions client that shows here. Previous versions is what gives my users the ability to restore their own files from previous points in time. But in order for this to work, I actually have to tell it, number one, to add in some storage for the creation of that shadow copy, and then to create the shadow copy. Now, one of the ways in which you can accomplish that is through the command line, and I would be aware of VSS admin and then the add shadow storage command. This gives me the ability to define some storage that I would use for shadow copies. VSS admin shadow storage for the C drive. I'm going to put that storage on the F drive, and then I can set a max size of a certain number of gigabytes, or even a percentage of that drive. So what is the maximum amount of storage that I want to set? Once I do that, that actually creates a location where shadow copies can store that metadata. And then to create the shadow copy, it's VSS admin create shadow for C:. You see how fast that happened? The process to create a shadow copy is really fast, because I'm just stopping, creating a kind of a baseline, and then allowing files to continue operating. So there's not that much work that has to go into this to ensure that from this point on, everything is based off of the initial starting point of that shadow copy. What's important is that once I create the shadow copy, the previous versions client now gives me the ability to open, copy, or restore contents that existed at that point in time. So this can be handy for your users if you don't really want to you don't really want to have to do all those individual spreadsheet restores. You might set this up as some kind of scheduled task so that you just create shadow copies once a day or once every couple of days for users to go about restoring their own content. If you want to take a look at the different shadows that are out there, you would use VSS admin list shadows to show you which shadows now exist. Probably want to go and remove some of the shadows from time to time as well, so you don't end up with a big old long list of them. But again, this is the way in which you can actually accomplish that. So I promised you kind of a really easy nugget here with this one. Configuring backups these days has just gotten almost, trivially easy. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about the configuration and management of backups, both through Windows Server Backup and through Windows Azure Backup. How both of these technologies are great for backing up servers, but how Windows Server Backup has a little bit more functionality in that it can do bare metal restores and system state restores, and how Windows Azure Backup is really designed for your data only. Talked about some of these role-specific gotchas that can happen with the backup operators group, and just a couple of the things you should be aware of in that VSS admin command line tool. In this nugget, we have talked only about the backup process, and arguably the more important thing to be aware of is the restore process, because that's where you really got to know what you're doing if you're going to bring destroyed data back to life. Talking about how to recover servers is going to be the topic for our next nugget. So until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.